Oh, hello there. Yes. Well, good grief. It's the weekend. That's rather cool, isn't it? Yes. Anyway, today I thought we'd return to that fascinating example of teacherhood that is Jonathan Gullis. Having pointed out yesterday about how unemployable he is, he did manage to crop up once again on Talk TV. We do seem to see a lot of this type of thing whereby the marketplace decides something and then the marketplace is patently wrong. Might come back to that as a concept, but Jonathan Gullis was roundly defeated as an MP at the last election, and yet he still turns up pontificating about various things, which I'm not really entirely convinced people want to hear, because if you watch him on, for example, LBC as he was recently, people do enjoy ringing up and telling him exactly what they thought of him and indeed the party and governments that he represented. Anyway, just over the last 24 hours, we've seen a lot of Katherine Birbalsingh, Britain's strictest head teacher, whatever that means, and darling of the right, generically, who is the head of a free school in London. And she's complaining very, very bitterly about the new Labour Party reforms, and I thought it was worthwhile just doing a deeper dive into what she had to say, because it's very, very, very debatable what she has to say, whether or not it's going to be a good or a bad thing. You can make up your own mind. There are links down below to what I'm about to go into. So, yes, she has managed to say on quite a few interviews that Labour is being blinded by Marxist ideology. I don't think that Katherine actually knows what Marxist ideology is. But it sounds okay, doesn't it? If you want to make something sound scary, you can call it a fascist thing or a Nazi thing, or you can call it Marxist. Personally, when I use the phrase fascist, it's because, somebody meets a criteria. Same with Nazi, and, well, Marxist, it's very hard to say to a certain extent, because, of course, it can encompass a lot of different things. But generically, it's bad, okay? So, the thing is about Katherine Birbalsingh, she had an article which was written in The Spectator. What problem is the Education Secretary trying to solve? We'll come to that question in just a bit. An open letter to Bridget Phillipson. Yes, and she did an interview, naturally, with the Daily Telegraph. So here we are again. Labour's education bill catastrophic for children, Birbalsingh warns. Britain's strictest head teacher, there she is again, says proposed forms are Marxist, whatever that means, and they threaten progress for disadvantaged children, which is something we'll undoubtedly come on to. So let's unpack this. The Children's Wellbeing Schools Bill, which is progressing through Parliament, would introduce the same pay scales across all state schools, ensure that all followed the national curriculum, make schools employ only qualified teachers or those working towards it, and limit uniforms to 3 branded items. Now, I don't know about you, but with my very limited knowledge of Marxism, I can't see a lot of it there. Not really sort of picking up on the formation of a young pioneers corps to indoctrinate the kids, or indeed anything else. I think most people would agree with quite a bit of that stuff there. It does inevitably leave out a vast amount of stuff in and around the notion of disadvantaged children, but we'll come back to that one. Okay, Birbalsingh criticised the Education Secretary for cancelling a grant for state school children learning Latin, which she said would allow them to compete with kids from Eton, adding, "What was the problem you were trying to solve?" Yes, indeed, the Labour Party have lot of jumping up and down about it. Decided basically just not to do kind of Latin in state schools. Okay, you can argue whether or not that's good or a bad thing, but what I'm intrigued about is this notion that you need to create a level playing field so that a kid from Eton is going to be weighed up against one of Katherine Birbalsingh's inner city black kids from her school. Okay, I don't think whether or not they did Latin GCSE is going to be the killer punch there. Just from my limited knowledge as a sociology teacher about the nature of class-based politics in the UK and, all of the evidence there is. So anyway, that's her problem that's trying to be solved. And I don't know. I'm astounded that somebody would earnestly, and she does earnestly believe this, because of course, although I'm an ideologue and she isn't, she does earnestly believe this thing, that magically if you can achieve a child sitting quietly in a blazer who has a Latin qualification, that it will set them up for life. I have my doubts, as I say, about that. Moving on. Forcing all schools to follow the national curriculum, which is currently under review, would cost schools time and money and lead to standards dropping, she said. Schools have different intakes across the country. Allowing us as school leaders the freedom to do what is best for our children is not just a sign of respect and trust for us teachers. Trust for teachers, wow. Recognising that you as a politician might not know as much as we do, what is best for our children whom we see daily. It also shows respect for families who are able to choose the school that is right for their child. Now, the national curriculum was brought in under Margaret Thatcher in 1986, I do believe. The GER Bill, Great Education or Education Reform Bill. You can look this stuff up. It was good enough for Margaret Thatcher for a very long period of time, and was maintained for a very long period of time because people basically agreed that the national curriculum was a good thing. When she says about all schools, what she means is all schools receiving state funding. She doesn't mean the private sector, and she's basically talking about herself here, because what Katherine does is she very often conflates the notion of what's good for her with what's good for everyone else, which is an ideological position held by many, many people on the right, okay? It's that self-interest notion. But would lead to standards dropping. How exactly would that lead to standards dropping? A uniform curriculum, which we used to have, which for years and years and years the Tories were arguing was one of the fundamental reforms they'd brought in under Thatcher in terms of raising standards, that thing that's bound to come up again. But this one, magically, once again forcing academies who can opt out, or to a certain extent, of the national curriculum to have to opt back in, is a bad thing. I don't understand the rationale for that. I can understand about schools choosing things, but schools are going to carry on doing that anyway. You get academies that have focused on sports or history and stuff like that, the humanities, from a very long time ago when academies were academies and weren't just state schools. I mean, the thing is about this, of course, that the vast majority of state schools are academies, so it's simply gathering everything together in terms of a national idea, which is what Thatcher wanted. And, I think it's important to stress the whole Thatcher thing, because I think if it was good enough for her, it probably wasn't Marxist. Yes. But what she means, as I say, is about choice. You see, there's this very, very ideologically based assumption that giving people choice inherently, even when they have none, is a good thing. So if you can choose between school A and school B, it's going to be a real plus. We might come on to ways of gaming that system in a little bit. Let's move on. Clearly, there needs to be a broad academic core for all children. But a rigid national curriculum that dictates adherence to a robotic, turgid and monotonous programme of learning that prevents head teachers from giving their children a bespoke offer tailored to the needs of their pupil is, quite frankly, horrifying. Yes, which is presumably as horrifying as it used to be. But the problem, and again, the problem is that successive governments, in particular from about the last 2 decades, have simply loaded things onto the national curriculum to the extent that it is turgid and dull, because that has come from central government, and it does need a rethink. And, the idea that she wants to opt out of certain things, okay, I'm sure that those kind of things are going to be available under the new national curriculum, because any teacher, yes, it's us again, will tell you that, broadly speaking, no matter what's on the curriculum, you don't have enough time to do it all. That's basically the way that it works. There is too much trying to be squeezed in between all those lessons on teaching kids that knife crime is bad, or whatever flavour of the week it is this week. She criticised part of the bill that would stop schools from hiring teachers who are not qualified or working towards this, saying, why would you want to prevent schools from hiring graduates and then getting them trained through a variety of routes when nationally we have a teacher shortage and recruitment problem? Yes, but let's unpack that, okay? Why do we have a teacher shortage and recruitment problem? Because pay scales are abysmally low. Because there's vast numbers of unqualified people in the system, that schools, being businesses, oh yes, got to be a business that's going to work better, basically will employ in the rather than having a qualified and experienced teacher. Yeah, you make schools a business, they will act like a business, and that's what they will do. There are economics lesson, right? There are fixed costs and there are variable costs. Your fixed costs, your buildings, your lighting, the rest of the stuff you just simply have to pay for. Your variable costs are your staff or what you're doing for the pupils. And if you are faced with, for example, I don't know, let's just say a government that is imposing cuts on you, then the one thing that you're going to cut is your staff budget. So that's what they're going to do. Gove started this thing, right? Okay. He said, well, I don't see why you can't have some physics PhD person who's desperate to work in a school for some reason, teach physics to year 9 on a Friday afternoon, who should have the freedom, schools should have the freedom to employ these people on any amount of money that they fancy, 12 squillion billion pounds a year. Except, of course, that isn't what happens, is it? They simply employ TAs to teach kids physics because they can't get hold of a physics teacher because the physics PhD graduate isn't going to work in a school. And you can see exactly why that isn't going to work. Teacher shortage and recruitment problem. Yes, at least in part with that, it is simply because Michael Gove decided, because ideologically, it's that old classic one again, ideologically they decided they don't like teaching unions. They go, they're always going on strike, aren't they, at the drop of a hat? Yeah, twice in 2 decades. All the time, leaving that aside, right, okay? So, of course, they would want to not employ qualified teachers like me. I'm expensive. Why? Because, I'm qualified and I have 20 odd years worth of experience. I'm going to come with a cost. I'm not prepared to work in some rubbish job for minimum pay. Sorry, that's not the way the market works, is it? Except, of course, unless you rig the market, in which case you're just going to basically get rid of qualified and experienced people like me because we're too bleeding expensive. Might be worthwhile thinking about that in terms of the freedoms that schools have. Why do schools have a freedom to basically treat me like dirt? And the answer is because that's capitalism. And that's an ideological thing, and it's very, very important. But yeah, Michael Gove suggested, for example, setting up a new a new professional body for teachers. The problem with that, of course, was that having decided that teachers shouldn't have a professional qualification, they decided to scrap it because they realised that basically what it meant was that anybody could therefore join the teacher's professional body. It was a meaningless concept because they didn't want teachers to be professionals. You cannot suggest, I'm afraid, that allowing schools to employ non-qualified teachers is going to improve standards. I'm sorry, Kathleen. It really doesn't work that way. It's a farcical notion. And she also sort of argues that somehow having national pay scales, one of the other things that the government wants to bring back in, again, was good enough for Margaret Thatcher for donkey's years. I imagine that, the Marxist in her was quite happy with that. This idea that magically people will be paid more if there aren't these national pay scales. It's a farcical notion. I personally have seen my pay in real terms drop quite a bit in terms of what I might have been expecting 20 years ago as a teacher. Reason? We don't have national pay scales anymore. Some schools still vaguely use those kind of things, but it would be good for recruitment that I would have this idea of where I might be going rather than what the school decides it can try and squeeze out of me. Anyway, moving on to the absolute farcical one. Restricting the number of branded uniform items would lead to less of a cohesive identity and more children being exposed to bad influences on the streets. Yes, okay, because kids aren't exposed to bad influences on the streets in a uniform. Try to get your head around that. Let's unpack it further. You have spoken about the importance of children feeling as if they belong for attendance to improve. For children to feel as if they belong, they must have something to belong to. Okay, their school must be allowed to brand their uniform items. Okay, they do. Without this, a sense of team is impossible. No, it isn't. And the most disadvantaged will suffer. Okay, might come back to the disadvantage. Branded school bags will allow teachers to see from a distance whether children are safely crossing the road or behaving on buses, and branded trousers and skirts make it harder for pupils to pull down or roll them up for style reasons. It's a doozy, this one. Limiting opportunities for sexual exploitation, Birbalsingh said. Yes, because if kids are wearing more expensive things that their schools dictate to them, they aren't going to be sexually exploited. I don't understand how that works. Perhaps Katherine can give me some concrete examples of how exactly that would work. And I don't know about you, but it's blindingly obvious what schools kids go to, because you can just tell. You know, I travel quite a lot on buses, for example, and I can tell what schools kids go to because, you know, they'll be wearing something from the school. It doesn't need to be everything. It doesn't need to be a 60 or 70 pound blazer. And one of the problems there has been over the years with the whole thing about branded school uniforms, which loads and loads of people have pointed out, is that lots of schools use that as a gatekeeping thing to keep out working class pupils from applying. If you're going to have to fork out 300 quid for your kid at age 11 to go to a particular school, you're probably going to think twice about it, which is a convenient way of gaming the system. I'm not suggesting that Katherine games the system, but she does seem very keen on those particular freedoms for herself rather than others. She added, I don't actually believe you hate poor kids. I just think you don't know what they need and what true social mobility looks like and is required to succeed. You give the impression of having an unreasonable and unwarranted dislike of academies and free schools, blinded by a Marxist ideology. Well, I'm sorry, Katherine, but I think that you're somewhat blinded by your ideology, and you have this notion about yourself and what you think is right for you, and you have managed to, one way or another, carve yourself out a nice niche position. But there are loads and loads of schools out there, of course, in terms of academies, that don't do that. There is no real evidence that turning in schools into academies improves performance. We've been arguing this for 15 years, and there's no slam dunk way of suggesting that it does. Okay? Now, we might talk about things like league tables. The other thing she was talking about was the PISA league tables, and this past Conservative government, and like Jonathan Gullis, bless him, and the rest of them are always keen on pointing that we've done so much better in the maths ones. We've risen a few places, and so much better in the English rankings. We've risen one place basically in about a decade. But what they never talk about, of course, is science, where we've dropped collectively against the OECD. Reason? Well, we can't employ science teachers, despite all of those freedoms that are going to be taken away. Now, if all of those freedoms were working, how come we've dropped down in science rankings? Well, because nobody with a science degree is going to go and work in a school for what amounts to, I don't know, what starting salary is. You're lucky if you're going to get 25k, and there's a very, very good chance that after 3 years you're going to say, sod this for a game of soldiers. You need a particular form of nasty, brutal, ideologically driven Marxist to actually survive in this system, such as myself, naturally. And of course, the elephant in the room here is always in terms of disadvantaged pupils, which is where Michaela will always go on about it, because her kids achieve. Great. But most kids don't. And I don't know about you, but I don't think necessarily the huge issue about why kids, for example, aren't achieving is to do with whether or not they're wearing branded trousers which can be seen at 50 paces at a bus stop, or indeed whether or not they've got a Latin GCSE. I think it has to do with rates of child poverty, which have gone through the roof. So many of our kids arrive in school in an absolutely dilapidated mental and physical state. It's a huge problem, and nobody is entirely sure, because it's immeasurable, exactly how much that holds them back. And even if they do achieve, let's say they do in Michaela's school, they do achieve and they get their grade 1 to 9 GCSEs and their brilliant passes, at English, maths and science. What then? Well, there's a good chance that they will find a very, very tough jobs market that will demand that they're experienced rather than qualified, because people have qualifications coming out of their ears at the moment. You may notice just that the starting pay for graduates has dropped like a stone in the last decade or so. There's a nasty, 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 vicious capitalist market out there, that ideology thing again, which basically means that kids know full well that they are going to have an uphill struggle, and it doesn't really matter if they've got Latin GCSE, because the kid from Eton is sure as hell going to be in front of them in the queue, and it just is a lie that their school uniform and how quiet they are in corridors is really going to do that. And sorry if I sound a bit kind of peeved and bitter about this, but I, and the job that I do, have to pick up the pieces in this system. Yeah, I have to deal with kids that haven't been in school for years because they've been thrown out because they don't fit properly within the business model of that particular institution. So if our present government can in some way get a handle on that and can actually achieve properly social mobility amongst our young people, I'll cheer it on. And I think Katherine should give it a go. I know she might have to alter her timetable, which is going to be a dreadful imposition on her. Still, her loss of freedom might actually mean freedoms for the rest of us. I'm personally a big fan of the human rights notion of not freedom to do things, but be freedoms from. And until we really address things like our children's freedom from poverty, we're not going to achieve anything else, no matter what trousers we are wearing. Do have a gorgeous, gorgeous day. Try and stay away from Jonathan Gullis. You know it makes sense.